Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make this procedural rain material. It's quite a complicated material. I'll explain it the best I can. For this tutorial, I'm just going to show you how to make the procedural rain material. I'll cover the rest of the scene in another video. I've already made tutorials to show you how to make nebula environments and whatnot. For the follow-up tutorial of this, I'll just show you how to put all the elements together. So without further ado, let's get to it. So the first thing I'll do, I'm just going to delete everything from my scene. So I'm just going to hit A, select all, delete. I'll then hit Shift A, we go for mesh, and I'm going to choose plane. I'll then hit numpad 7 to go into top view. Maybe I'll hit numpad 5 to go into perspective view. I'm going to take my cursor to the bottom left until I see a crosshair. I'll then left click and drag and open up a new window. I'll change this window from the 3D viewport to shader editor because all the work is going to be done in the shader editor. I'll then click new to add a new material, and we'll call this Pro Rain for procedural rain. I'll just hit N to hide the end panel, delete the principal BSDF, we don't need that. I'll then hit Shift A, input, and we choose texture coordinates. So for this one, we're going to be using UV coordinates. So you're going to need a UV map for this to work. When we add a plane, it should already have a UV map. Let me just check, go to UV editing. Yep, we've got a UV map, excellent. I'll just go back to my layout view with the node wrangler enabled. If you go to edit, preferences, and go to add-ons, and then just type in node and make sure that you've got the node wrangler enabled. If it's not installed on your computer, you'll have to go to get extensions and search it in there. So with the node wrangler enabled, I'm going to hold down control shift and left click the texture coordinate. I'll left click again until it's on UV coordinates. So this is the UV coordinate system. So what we need to do is divide this into sections. To do that, we use a vector math node. So I'm going to hit Shift A, go to converter, and we choose vector math. I'll pop that into there. We're going to need two of these. So the first one we're going to set to multiply. I'll hit Shift D, I'll pop that into there, and for this one we're going to set to fraction. Now if we change the X, Y and Z to 1, and if we increase this X value, you can see it's dividing the plane into several sections. Excellent. So maybe I'll set that to 12 just for now. We can change this a bit later on. Now I want to add a controller for this X vector here. Drag this up, give us a bit more room so we can see what we're doing a bit better. So I'm going to take this texture coordinate, I'm going to hit G, I'm going to drag it across to there, Shift A, converter, and I'm going to choose combine XYZ. Plug the vector into the bottom vector of the vector math node. The bottom two we're going to set to 1, and then I'm going to add a value node. Shift A, type in V for value, and we choose the value node. I'll then plug that into the X factor, and I'm going to set this to 12. Now this becomes the controller for how many drops that we have. Now what we need to do is to divide this horizontally. I'm going to repeat the same division trick, but instead of doing it vertically, we're going to do it horizontally, which should be on the y-axis. I'll just take this vector math node. I'm going to hit Shift D. I'm going to pop that into there. We'll take the fraction. I'm going to hit Shift D. I'm going to pop that into there. Now we're going to set all these to 0. And instead of multiplying, we're going to change this to add because we want to add the flow in. And so on the y-axis, if we drag that across, you can see we've got a flowing movement going on there. Now we want to add a controller to this. So I'm just going to take this combine XYZ. I'm going to hit Shift D, drag it over to here. I'm going to plug it into the bottom socket of this vector math node. I'm going to set the X, Y, and Z to 0. I'm then going to hit Shift A, go to converter, and we're going to choose math node. I'm going to set this to divide. I'll then plug the result from that into the Y socket of the combine XYZ. Instead of keyframing this value, I'm going to create a driver. So type in hashtag frame, hit enter, and we're going to divide it by, let's say, 75. Now if I push play, we should be getting a flow going on here. Excellent. Maybe I can increase the speed of that. Let's say divide it by 50. Okay, that seems a reasonable speed. Now we need to randomize these values because obviously raindrops aren't all going to fall at the same time. We're going to randomize it using a white noise texture. Let me just shimmy some of these nodes across. Shift A, texture, white noise texture. I'll take this fraction node here. I'm going to hit Control Alt D, and that will duplicate the node while maintaining the connection to the previous node. We're then going to change this to ceiling. And now if I plug the value from that into the white noise, I'm then going to hit Control Shift and left click the white noise, and as you can see, it's given us a random value for each segment. Control Shift and left click again, you can see it's given us random colors. So we got 3 separate channels there, red, green and blue, each one with a random number. Box select all of these. I'm going to hit G, drag this across. Now if I add a separate XYZ, Shift A, converter, and separate XYZ, I'll pop that into there. So now we've got 3 random seeds. Excellent. I'll then hit Control Shift and left click this fraction just so we can view our end result. And maybe I can set this white noise random values here. Maybe we can put it in between the divide and the combine XYZ here. I'll have to add a math node, so Shift A, converter, we choose math node. I'll change this to multiply, and then I'll plug the X socket from the separate XYZ into the bottom socket of this math node. And if I hit play, you can now see that the flow is randomized. Now we want to be able to control the speed of these, so we don't want any of the drops going really slow and really fast, so we can control that with a map range node. So I'll just drag this across here. I'm going to hit Shift A, go to converter, and we choose map range. I'll then pop that in between the X socket and the multiply node. If I don't want the flow to be too slow, I'm going to take this to minimum factor, and I'm going to set this to 0.5. Let me just drag this over here so it's nice and neat. Now if I skip back to frame 1, I'm going to hit play. As you can see, they're all randomized and none of them are going too slow. Excellent. We do have this problem where they all start at the same time at the beginning of the frame. We're going to change that by doing a simple addition. So I'll just box select all of these. I'm going to hit G, drag these across. I'm going to duplicate this math node, hit Shift D and pop it in there. We're going to change it to add. I'll then take a random seed from this Y socket and plug it into the bottom socket of this math node, and hopefully if I go back to frame 1, yep, they all start on a random seed. Excellent. Now we've got one additional seed value here, one additional number on the Z, and we can use that to randomize the length of each drip, because currently all the drips are exactly the same length, they're just at different times and we want different lengths. To achieve that, I'm going to take this vector math node, I'm going to hit Shift D and I'm going to pop it in here. I'm going to change it to multiply. I'll then use another combine XYZ, so I'm going to take this combine XYZ, I'm going to hit Shift D and I'm going to plug it into the bottom socket of this vector math node. Let's just drag this across so we can see what we're doing. I'll then take this Z socket from this separate XYZ and plug it into the Y socket of this combine XYZ. Now if I push play, you can see they're all different lengths, but we're definitely going to have to add a level of control. So I'm going to hit Shift A, go to converter, and we'll choose map range. And I'm going to pop that in between the Z socket and the Y socket of the combine XYZ and the separate XYZ. I'm just going to hold down Shift and right click and drag to add a noodle control point here. I'll just drag this over to here. It's just for visual cue so we can see where this is going. Now these values on this map range node, pretty easy. The 2 max is the higher this number, the shorter the drips, and the 2 min, the higher this number, the shorter the drips, or the lower the number, the longer the drips. So I'm going to set a minimum drip length to, let's say, 0.75, and a maximum drip length to, let's say, 3. Now if I hit play, okay, I'm going to increase this minimum to 1. I don't want the drips to be too long. Excellent. We also need to change the X and Z values on this combine XYZ to 1. Now we're going to shape these cells because raindrops and rain streaks aren't square, they're kind of rounded off. So I'm going to hit Shift A, converter, and we choose separate XYZ. I'm going to pop that into here, and then we're just going to use a color ramp to shape this. So Shift A, converter, choose color ramp, and I'm going to select this first flag. I'm going to set this to black. I'm going to click this plus button to add another flag, and we'll set this to white. And then it's simply a case of just dragging these values across. So this is going to basically be how thick the raindrops are going to be. Maybe I can change it from linear to ease just to give a smoother fall off. Maybe I'll give these precise values. So I'll set this one to 0.4, maybe set this one to 0.6. And now we're going to multiply this result with this Y factor here. So Shift A, go to converter, we're going to choose math, pop that in between there, change it from add to multiply, and then plug the Y socket into the bottom socket of the multiply node. Now we've kind of got this effect going on here. Let me just turn off the overlays. So now we need to round these off because they're rounded at the bottom, but they're not rounded at the top. That's easy enough. All I'll do is I'm going to select this color ramp, I'm going to hit G, just going to bring this up to around about there. I'll then hit Shift D and duplicate that color ramp, and I'm going to pop it in between the Y socket and the multiply node. I'll then drag this black flag all the way across to something around about there. I'll take the white flag, I'm going to drag this over to here, and maybe I'm going to drag this last black flag here and just drag this up to around about, maybe all the way to the end. Maybe I can increase this gap here just so there's a bit more space in between the raindrops. Okay, maybe I can give them a bit more thickness. So I'm going to take this flag, just going to drag it across, maybe take this one across, to around about there. So obviously raindrops and rain streaks aren't completely straight. We need to randomize this, so we need to give it a bit of wiggle. That's easy enough. So I'm just going to box select all of these up into the separate XYZ. I'm going to hit G, I'm going to grab these across, and I'm going to hit Shift A, go to texture, and we're going to choose noise texture. I'll then change this to 4D. I'm going to be using UV coordinates for this, so I'm going to hit Shift A, go to input, and we choose texture coordinate. I'll just pop that there, and I'm going to plug the UV into the vector. I'll then hit Shift A, go to color, and we choose mix color. I'm going to pop that in between the fraction and the separate XYZ. I'll then change it from mix to linear light, and I'll plug the color from the noise texture into the bottom socket. Now if we use this mix factor, you can see it's mixing in randomization into the streaks. Maybe I'll decrease the scale to 2.5. I'm going to keep the detail and the roughness low. We're also going to animate this W factor. I'm going to use a driver, so I'm going to hit Shift A, go to converter, and we choose math. I'm going to set this to divide. For the top value, I'm going to type in hashtag frame, hit enter. Now if I plug this value into the W factor, it's going to go a bit crazy because we're only dividing it by 0.5. So I'm going to increase this number to, let's say, 50 for now. Now if I hit play, okay, it's a bit too wiggly, so maybe we can increase that to, let's say, 100. Divide it by 100. Still a bit too wiggly. Maybe I'll bump that up to 500. We just want it subtle so they don't all fall on the same line every time. Okay, I'm happy with that. Maybe I can bump the detail up to 4. Actually, I'm going to say 2.5. I'm going to bump the detail up to 2.5. That'll be my final result there. So I don't want raindrops on every single cell. I want to randomize that. So in order to do that, we're going to go back over here, and with this white noise texture, oh by the way, with the white noise we can change this to 4D, and that means we can change this W factor, which will give us completely random different cells. So with the white noise selected, I'm going to hit Control Shift and D, and that will duplicate that node whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node. I'll pop that there. I'll then duplicate this separate XYZ, Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to pop the color into the vector. So now if I hit Control Shift and left click just to preview this node, now we can change this W factor, and that will give us completely different random results. Maybe something around there perhaps. Actually, I'm going to set it to an all-round number 10. Now we can use these cells to cancel out some of these channels. It should be easy enough. Control Shift and left click to view that. Let me just drag these nodes down. So I'm going to hit G, just grab these down so we can see what we're doing. I'll then hit Shift A, go to converter, and we choose math, and I'm going to change it from add to greater than. And if I plug this in between here, this is going to be the threshold. So 1 will be 100%, 0.5 will be 50%, and let's say 0.25. So that means 25% of the gradients is going to be blacked out. Maybe I'll change the W factor. Let's say, just going to keep changing this until I find a value that I'm happy with. Maybe, no, they're too evenly spread. You want something kind of random. Maybe something around there. Maybe I'll decrease the threshold. Maybe something around there. I'll be happy with that. Now all we have to do is multiply this value with the final output here. So I'll just drag this across over to here. I'll grab this multiply node. I'm going to hit Shift D, drag this over to here. I'll pop this into the bottom socket, and I'll pop this into the top socket. And yeah, there we go. It's cancelled out those channels there. Excellent. I'm not really happy with all the raindrops taken out, so I'm just going to go back over to here. I'm going to hit Control Shift and left click the greater than, just so we can see the cells, and I'm going to change this factor until I've got 2 thin strips randomly in the thing. Maybe 1 strip, 2 strips, that's absolutely fine. I'd prefer them kind of evenly spaced if I could, something like that. Excellent. I then reconnect this value into the surface, so maybe we can randomize the length of these drips a bit. So I'm going to select this color ramp. I'm going to hit Control Shift D to duplicate that color ramp whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node. Let me just drag this across over to here. In fact, I'll just grab all of these over. I'm then going to hold down Shift, right click and drag to add a control point here. And now if I connect this color ramp to this noodle point here, I'm then going to drag this black flag all the way across to round about there perhaps. I'll then reconnect the first color ramp. I'm going to select that control point. I'm going to hit Control X to dissolve that. Shift A, go to color, and we choose mix color. I'm going to pop that in between the color ramp and the math node. I'll then plug this color ramp into the bottom socket. So now if we mix between the 2 color ramps, one's short, one's long. So now I'm going to use a random value. So we're going to use this random value on the Y socket of this separate XYZ, and I'm going to plug it into the factor of this mix color. We could also add another greater than node. So Shift D, pop that into there. I'm going to set this value to 0.5. So that means 50% of the streaks are going to be long, 50% will be short. Let me just swap these over. Excellent. I might hold down shift, right click and drag to add a control point here. Just going to hit G, just bring this down, just so we can see where it's going. I might do the same for this one. Hold down shift, right click, drag, G, just bring this down, just so we can see where it's going. Excellent. So now we need to add the droplets into the mix. So I'm just going to select the material output. I'm just going to drag this across over to here. Now I'll add a Voronoi texture. So shift A, go to textures, and we choose Voronoi. Just zoom in. I'm going to hit Control, Shift, and left click to connect it to the output. It just gives us loads of random points. Maybe I can set this to 4D, and now we just add a color ramp. So that's Shift A, converter, and we choose color ramp. I'm going to pop that in there. I'm going to click this arrow here, click flip color ramp, and then I'm going to drag the black flag all the way across until we've got these random points here. Maybe I'll set the black flag to, let's say, 0.333, change the scale, increase the scale, so we've got lots of points, roughly the same size as the streaks. We're going to add another level of these, so we're going to have bigger droplets and smaller droplets. So now we need to add these together, so I'm going to do that with a math node. So I'm going to take this math node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, I'm going to pop it in between here, plug this into the bottom socket. We'll change this from multiply to maximum. I'll then take this value and plug it into the top socket. And now they're all mixed together. Excellent. Again, I'm going to use the UV coordinate system for this. So I'm going to grab these two nodes, just going to drag them down to around about here. I'll then hit Shift A, go to input, and we choose texture coordinate. And we're going to use the UV coordinates. So I'm going to change the scale on this to, let's say, 30, something around there. So now we need to randomize the shape of these dots because obviously raindrops aren't perfectly round on a window. We need the form to do that. I'm just going to take this texture coordinate. I'm going to drag it across over to here. I'm going to hit Shift A, go to texture, and I'm going to choose noise texture. I'm going to change it from 3D to 4D. We'll plug the UV coordinate into the vector of the noise texture. Shift A, go to color, and we choose mix color. I'm going to pop that between the UV texture coordinate and the vector of the Voronoi texture. I'm going to change it from mix to linear light. I'll then plug the color from the noise texture into socket B. Now if I zoom in, and now if we adjust the mix factor, you can see how it's deforming the droplets. So maybe I want to increase the scale to, let's say, 10. And I'll decrease the mix factor all the way down to something quite low, maybe 0.05. Maybe increase the scale to 20, and I'm going to decrease the mix factor to 0.025, something around there. And now we can animate this W factor because over time we want the droplets to deform, so that's easy. Shift A, converter, choose math. I'm going to change it from add to divide. I'll add a driver in the top value, so that's hashtag frame, and I'm going to divide it, let's say, by 500 for now, and we'll plug this value into the W factor. I'll then push play to see the rate of change because we don't want these to move too fast. Okay, that's way too fast. Maybe we can divide it by 1000. I'll hit play. Still too fast. Divide it by 10,000. Hit play. Now you can see they're changing very subtly over time. Excellent. Maybe I can actually bump up the detail to 4. I also want to change the distribution of the Voronoi as well. So we might be able to get away with using this driver here. So I'm going to plug the value from this divide node into the W factor of the Voronoi. I'm going to hit play. And as you can see, they're disappearing and reappearing in different places whilst deforming at the same time. Excellent. I'm happy with that. Maybe I'll hit Shift, right click and drag just to add a control point there. I'll then hit G just to drag this down just so we can see where it's going. Excellent. I'll just neaten up these nodes. Now we're going to create finer droplets. To do that, I'm just going to box select all of these. I'm going to hit Shift D, drag it down to around about there. I'm going to duplicate this math node, which is set to maximum. So Shift D, just pop that down here. And then we'll plug the result from this color ramp into the bottom socket of this math node. And now all we do is we change the scale of this bottom Voronoi. So I'm going to increase this scale, let's say 100. It gives us finer droplets, and we're also going to have to reset this driver. To reset the driver, in the top value, I'm going to type in hashtag frame. If I zoom in, so now if I push play, the rate of the finer droplets are going to change a lot faster than the bigger ones because we changed the scale. So instead of having 10,000 there, I'm actually just going to type in 25,000. Hit enter, hit play. Okay, it's still changing a bit too fast for me, so I'm going to change it to 30,000. See what happens there. Okay, I'm kind of happy with that. Excellent. Maybe for the finer droplets, we can decrease them slightly. So I'm going to take this black flag, just going to drag it back to around about there. I might increase the raindrop frequency. So we just go all the way over to the beginning, where this value node is, right at the beginning here. And I'm going to increase this to, let's say, 20. So you've got more raindrops. If you made it this far, it's a good idea to save your project. So go to File, Save As, and then select a file location of your choosing. I'm going to save mine as like and subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. And then simply click Save As. Maybe I want to increase the warp a bit, so I'm just going to drag this all the way over to 1. Maybe I can change the scale so we got a bit more warp in there, and I'll decrease the factor to 0.5 again. One thing I might do is for the finer droplets, so these bottom textures here, I'm going to change the white value to 0.5 so it's less intense. And when we add this as a bump map, that means that the smaller droplets will be 50% less bump than the larger droplets, so they're not as predominant. Maybe I can decrease the scale of these bigger ones, so I'm going to go up to my top Voronoi up here, type in 50, so they're a little bit smaller. Actually they're a bit too small. I'm going to choose 40, okay, and maybe I can just drag this flag across so we've got less of them, maybe 0.3, and for this bottom one I'm going to set to 0.25. Seems like a good mix. Maybe I can decrease the scale of this to 75, or a little bit bigger. Okay, there's a few more steps to do before we can call this complete, nothing too taxing. So down here with the water droplets, with the scale, I'm going to set the top one to 40, and I'm going to set the bottom one to 80. So the bottom one is double the scale of the top one, and that is so we can control this with a value node. So I'm going to hit Shift A, go to search, and just type in V for value, and select a value node. I then hit Shift A, go to converter, and we choose math. Now this top value was set to 40 on the scale. So over here, I'm going to set this to 40, and we'll change the math node from add to multiply, and we're going to multiply it by 2, because 2 times 40 will be 80, which will give us this value here. Now I'll plug this value into the top scale of this Voronoi texture, and I'll plug this multiply node into the scale of this bottom Voronoi texture. Let's just drag these across. So now if I drag this value, it's going to change both the scales proportionate to each other. So with this value node selected, I'm going to hit Control J, and that will add a frame. I'll then hit F2, and I'll rename the frame to droplet size. Maybe I'll give the frame a color, so I'm going to hit N to open up the N panel. I'm going to go to Node, under the Node tab up here, I'm going to click Color. I'll expand the options, and I'm going to change the color to something like light blue, maybe a bluish tone, something around there. So when we zoom out, we can automatically identify the controllers. Now we need to add a controller for the streaks, which I believe was this value here. Let's just hit play and we'll test that. I'm just going to type in 10. Yep, okay, I'll type in 50. So I'll skip back to frame 1. I'm going to hit Shift A, go to search, type in V for value, add a value node, and that value was 50. So I'm going to type in 50. I'll then plug the value from the value node into the bottom socket of this divide node, and that controls the speed. So I'll drag that over to there. I'll then hit Control J to add a frame. I'll hit F2 to rename that frame, and I'll type in streak speed. I'll also give that a color. So I'm going to go over to my end panel over here. I'm going to click the color, and I'm going to change the color to, let's say, a green, something around there. The next controller we have is this value node here, which is the frequency of the streaks. So I'm just going to grab that value node. I'm going to hit G. Just going to grab that across over to about there. I'm going to hit Control J to add a frame. I'll hit F2, and I'll type in streak frequency. And again, I'm going to give that a color. Maybe I'll change this color to something like a yellow, orange, something around there. So now we can quickly identify the 3 main controllers for this. That's the procedural rain mask complete. We can now get on with adding this onto a material. I'll reactivate my overlays in my 3D viewport. I'll then hit RX90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. Just hit play just to make sure I've got the right orientation. Excellent. I'll just zoom into my material output over here. I'm going to hit N to hide the end panel. Maybe I'll just drag this up to around about there. I'm going to grab my material output, just drag it over to here. I'll zoom in. I'll then hit Shift A, go to shader, and we'll choose Principal BSDF. I'm going to plug the Principal BSDF into the surface of the material output. I'll hit Shift A, go to vector, and I'm going to choose bump. I'll then plug the last node in the tree on the math node, set to maximum, into the height of the bump node. I'm going to click clamp just to make sure that we don't go above or below 1 or 0. I'll then plug the normal from the bump node into the normal of the principal BSDF. There we go. Maybe I can turn the strength down to, let's say, 0.25, maybe 0.5. Okay. I'll then go to transmission. I'm going to turn the weight up to 1. So this is going to be like a glass material. I'll turn the roughness down to 0. I'm going to increase the frequency. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to increase the frequency to 50. Maybe I can change the mix of the noise going into these streaks because they seem a bit straight to me. So that's over here under this linear light node. So smack bang in the middle of your node structure. I'm going to go to linear light, this one, after the noise texture. Maybe I can bump that up to, let's say, 0.75. I'll decrease my frequency of the streaks, let's say 30, something around there. Okay, kind of happy with that. I'm also going to go into cycles over here. So change your render engine from Eevee to cycles. I'm going to go into rendered view, and over here where it says object in your shader editor, I'm going to change it from object to world. And with your background node selected, hit Ctrl T, and that will add a texture coordinate node, a mapping node, and an environment texture node. I'm then going to click open. Open up an HDRI of your choice. I'm going to open up a space environment. I made a tutorial for this, so I'll leave a link in the description. That's actually 2 tutorials. One's to create a starry night with a gradient, and the other one is to overlay a nebula on top of that. Alternatively, you can join my Patreon as a free member, and I've actually uploaded about 20 space nebula environment HDRs, all in EXR format. So I'm going to select nebula environment 15.exr. I'm going to increase the strength to, let's say, 4. I'll then hit Shift A, go to color, and I'm going to choose gamma, and I'm going to pop that in between my nebula environment HDR and the background. I'll then increase the gamma to 1.25. Let's see what that does. I'm going to add a camera in my scene, so Shift A and go to camera, and we choose camera. I'll then hit numpad 1, numpad period, and Control Alt numpad 0, and that will set my camera to the view. I'll then go to my object data tab over here. I'll change the Z location to 0. I'm going to keep the rotation on the X-axis to 90. Maybe I'll go to my camera data down here. I'm going to change it to 24 mil. I'll then go back to my object data over here, and I'm going to decrease the Y location until it encompasses the entire scene. Something around about there. Maybe I'll decrease the gamma to 1 just so it's a bit brighter so we can see what we're doing a bit better. I'll then change it from world to object data. I'll select my window object. I'm going to increase the streak frequency to 40. Maybe I can decrease the length of some of these streaks here. So for this bottom color ramp, just going to drag this across just slightly, a bit more, and I'm going to drag this one across to around about there. Now if I hit play, let's just see what we've got. Still a bit long, around about there, perhaps. Okay, I'm just going to go into look dev view. As you can see, these are a bit harsh here, so they're quite pointy. Let's try and get rid of that harshness and smooth it out a bit. So I'm going to zoom in into these top 3 color ramps, and I think it's this last color ramp. Yep, okay, it's this one here. So I'm going to add a map range, Shift A and converter, and we choose map range. I'm going to pop that in between here. I'm going to change it from linear to smoother step. Let's just mute that. Yep, you can see it is having an effect. Excellent. I'll go back into cycles rendered view. So now just going to go into viewport shading. I'm going to go to my render settings over here. I'm going to change my max samples to 256. I'm going to change the noise threshold to 0.025. I then go to light paths down here. I'm going to turn off reflective and refractive caustics, and I'm just going to hit F12 just to see what we've got. Okay, they look a bit big to me, so I'm just going to increase the frequency. I'll just go to rendered view quick. I'm going to go over to streak frequency. Maybe I'll set this to 75. And for the droplets, maybe I can increase the droplets. That's the droplet size. I might increase them just by dragging this color ramp, the bottom one to 0.333 and the top one to 0.333. Maybe I can increase the warp of the streaks themselves with this factor here. So I might set that to 0.9 just so they're a bit more bendy. In fact, I'm going to go to look dev view, and maybe I can increase the scale of the warp factor. Maybe, let's say, a value of 8, maybe 20. That might be a bit too much. Yeah, that's way too much. Maybe a value of 15. That means we're going to have to change the amount of how the warp changes on the W factor for that noise texture, because it's changing a bit too much. As you can see, they're like sliding all left, right and center. We don't want that. So maybe I can increase this value to 1000. Let's just see what that looks like. Hit play. They're changing a bit too fast, so maybe 2000. We just want it to change gradually over time, because usually you'll find a streak will follow the path. Okay, kind of happy with that. Maybe we can mute some more of the streaks because they all look a bit uniform at the moment. So down here, if you remember, this cancels out a lot of the streaks, this factor here. So maybe I'll set this to 0.5. So we've got 50% of the streaks in the shot. And where I've increased the frequency of the streaks, I'm also going to have to change the size of the droplets to match the streaks. Maybe something around the 80 mark. And because we changed the droplet size, we're also going to have to change the rate of which the droplets change. So maybe I'll change this to 50,000. So they're a bit slower. Maybe 80,000. Okay, kind of happy with that. I'll just hit F12. Maybe I can increase the streak thickness slightly. So with the window selected, if you remember, the streak thickness was this top color ramp here. So I'm just going to drag this black flag across slightly. I'll drag this one across slightly, just so it roughly matches. Maybe I'll set this one to 0.7 and I'll set this one to 0.3. Okay, kind of happy with that. One last render. Hit F12. Maybe I can do like a shadow hack, because I think there's shadows coming through here. It probably won't affect the glass as is, but if this was in a room, this glass would actually block out a lot of light. So I'll just show you a quick light hack. I'll hit Shift A, go to shader, and we'll choose transparent shader. Shift A, shader, and we'll go for mix shader. I'll pop the mix shader in between the principal BSDF and the material output. Plug the transparent into the bottom socket. Just make sure that that's set to white. Shift A, input, and we choose light path. Drag the is shadow ray into the mix factor. If we go into rendered view, you probably won't see any difference, but if you're going to use this window on a building, I recommend having this set up, because it will make it so that light can pass through the window without casting any shadows. Let's just choose a random frame. I hit play just to see what we've got, make sure it's working okay. I'll go back to look dev. I'm going to hit F12 to render out that frame, and that's the final result. I've just made a couple of tweaks to the settings because the final render I wasn't happy with the results, so I'll just go through those with you. So I'm going to go into full screen, so I'm going to hit Control Spacebar over the node screen. So first off, the streak frequency is set to 75. I've reduced the streak speed to 25. I believe it was on 50 before. I've increased the threshold on the greater than node at the top to 0.8 and the greater than node on the bottom to 0.6. And up here, where the noise texture is mixed with this fraction vector, I've decreased the mix factor on the linear light to 50%. The droplet size I've kept to 80. Over here, I've just added a texture coordinate node, a mapping node, a noise texture node, and a color ramp, which is plugged into the roughness. And that's just to add a bit of grime to the window. And more importantly, if you want this to work in Eevee, add a value node, set it to a really low number. I've set mine to 0.01 and I've plugged it into the thickness. That will enable the glass to be transparent in Eevee. I'll just hit Control Spacebar and exit the full screen of the node editor. And over here, under your render settings, if you want to render this in Eevee, just flip it from cycles to Eevee. Enable ray tracing. These are my settings for ray tracing. And with the window procedural rain material selected, I'm going to go to my material tab over here and just scroll down until it says settings. I've enabled the light probe volume. We probably don't need that. I've got transparent shadows set to divid, ray trace transmission, and I've set the thickness to sphere, which works quite well with a plane. If you're using glass with a rounded object like a sphere, then you might want to change that from sphere to slab. You'll have to play with that setting. For my cycles render engine, I just flip back to cycles. My max samples are set to 32 samples and the noise threshold is 0.025, and the reason I can get away with it so low is because all the scene is literally just an HDR. I've also added this cube here, and the reason I've added this cube is my camera's in the cube and it blocks out any light rays from behind the camera hitting this glass window, so the only light that's coming from the window is coming from the outside. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.